Today, it's the story of a legendary musician who was put on trial for plagiarizing himself. Yeah, he was sued for writing a song that sounded too much, well, like him. The rights to have your own musical style hung in the balance in this case. If found guilty, this artist's record label would get the royalties and the last laugh. But if found innocent, songwriters everywhere could breathe a sigh of relief. We're letting you be judge and jury on this one. Was this song a carbon copy clone, or was it an original tune with some sonic similarities? You're going to give the verdict next on Professor of Rock. Hey, music junkies, Professor of Rock, always here to celebrate the greatest artists and the greatest songs of all time. You know, if you remember when it was time to turn the record or the cassette over to side 2, you're going to dig this channel. Make sure that you subscribe below right now. I think you're going to like this channel. We'd love to have you check the bell so you never miss out on our daily content. We also have a Patreon you're going to want to check out. There you're going to find even more content. We have a new series that started there going behind the scenes of these great live events that are happening. Check that out. You can also become an honorary producer to help us curate this history. From 1967 to 1972, Creedence Clearwater Revival was an all-out musical powerhouse, producing a slew of memorable hits, led by John Fogerty, who took on the roles of lead singer, lead guitarist, and chief songwriter. CCR released 6 multi-platinum albums and 1 gold record, yielding 10 top 20 pop hits. They were amazing. However, by the early 70s, infighting began to plague Creedence, and tensions escalated, particularly between John and the rest of his bandmates. 1971's hit, Have You Ever Seen the Rain? That was John's plea to the band to put their differences aside. Have you ever seen the rain? But it wasn't in the cards. Creedence Clearwater Revival split for good in 1972 following the release of their Mardi Gras album. When he went solo, Fogerty had the moniker the Blue Ridge Rangers for his first album. I got the Blue Ridge Mountain Blues. Unfortunately, the record didn't rise to his or the label's expectations. But an underperforming album would be the least of John Fogerty's worries at that point. Fogerty was about to spend years of his life embroiled in a bitter dispute with his label Fantasy Records, run by Saul Zaentz. This was the first of many legal problems that arose. It happened when Fogerty charged that Fantasy had not adequately promoted his first solo record and demanded a release from his contract. It was a request that would not be granted. As it turned out, the contract that CCR signed stipulated that should the group break up, Fantasy would retain control over each artist until it was December 31st, 1974. Additionally, the fine print also stated each member had to deliver a certain number of recordings per year. If they didn't, the number got added to the recordings owed the company for the next year. This meant that if Fogerty or any of his former bandmates failed to meet their quota, Fantasy could continue to extend the terms of the agreement to a later date of their discretion. In other words, indefinitely. John was fuming, and he felt like he was being treated very unfairly, especially since Saul Zaentz had let all the other members of Creedence out of their respective contracts at that point. Secretly, he entered into talks with David Geffen at Asylum Records. He told him about his woes with Fantasy, and Geffen agreed to buy out Fogerty's contract. But the sum that Saul Zaentz requested was very substantial. So Asylum only bought the rights to release Fogerty's music in the US and Canada. Still, for John Fogerty, it was a step in the right direction, and he got back to work in earnest. In 1975, John Fogerty released a second solo album, but again, it achieved only moderate commercial success. Since Fantasy owned the rights to Fogerty's music internationally, he felt like he was, filling Saul's pockets with cash, whenever they played his music. It was kind of a catch-22 in the worst way. Playing his songs meant the man that he despised just got richer. But if he boycotted his old material, it was tantamount to career suicide. Everyone coming to see him, of course, wanted to hear the CCR hit list. As a result of this conundrum, by the late 70s, John entered into one of the darkest periods of his life. He was angry, he was depressed, He couldn't hear his own songs without getting really angry. No longer did he want to write, record, or play his music live, and his resentment towards Fantasy Records only continued to fester. It got to the point in the early 80s where John Fogerty decided to sign away his future Creedence royalties just so that he could cut ties with Fantasy altogether. Up to that point, he had been defending and trying to protect the good name of Creedence Clearwater Revival the best that he could. But now the only thing he wanted was to get away from all of that. It's just crazy. Now, as we continue to tell the story of this, I want to thank our sponsor, Zenni Eyewear, that helps to make this possible. They're the only glasses for me. Right now, you can get a pair of frames for less than $7. Go to Zenni.com and pick your poison, color, your shape, your fashion. You can also see how you look before you buy with Zenni's virtual try-on. You're going to dig it. So for about a 10-year period from 1975 to 1985, the world was deprived of the musical talents of John Fogerty. It had really just been radio silence. But unknown to the rest of us, by August 1984, John Fogerty had written 6 new songs. When he approached his new label, Warner Brothers, the following month, he wasn't sure if any of the songs would be commercially viable. So much time had passed by. He'd been out of the game for so long, and he really struggled with self-doubt. But when producer Lenny Waronker responded to what John Fogerty played for him, Fogerty thought that he had to be overreacting. Waronker was so happy, so excited. He wanted to move ahead with the material. When John got home late that night, his wife and kids were already asleep. So to break the news, he posted a note on the fridge, and it had a picture of a dancing chimpanzee, and it read, "The monkey is off my back." John finished the album in really a matter of weeks. He named it Center Field, and his title track perfectly summed up his feelings at that time. "Put me in, coach, I'm ready to play."
Oh, put me in, coach, I'm ready to play.
Yes, Fogerty's swamp rockin' sound was finally back on the airwaves. The album was a smash hit, featuring the singles Rock and Roll Girls that came in at number 20 on the Billboard Hot 100. The aforementioned Center Field that hit number 44, and today's feature, The Old Man Down the Road, that rose to number 10, but it also went to number 1 on the top rock tracks.
The old man is down the road.
Said John Fogerty about his comeback hit, "I remember riding The Old Man Down the Road like it was yesterday. I was in my little room in Albany playing this Washburn Falcon guitar. The first time you pick up the guitar on any given day, you're not all warmed up. Your brain is off somewhere else. So you noodle. I had the guitar plugged into a cool little tube amp that had a slightly overdriven sound. And I'm doing my swamp stuff. Suddenly I went, For a moment, John Fogerty was frozen in time, hoping that the next thing that he played would be that 1 in a million group of notes that could complete the riff. Then suddenly it came. And he had it. After adding a little rhythm on his special E7 chord, he thought, okay, maybe this is the song. This could be the song. Next, Fogerty started flipping through his title notebook for a lyrical idea. Thumbing through the pages, he saw the words "somewhere down the road." And it piqued his curiosity. He asked himself, what was down the road? The thought of an old man came to him. But who was he? Someone evil? Maybe the devil? Whoever or whatever this old man was, there was something ominous about it all.
The old man is down the road.
Fogerty liked the idea, and so, he was off and running. He'd take the thunder from the mountain, he'd take a lightning from the sky.
Mountain, he take a lightning from the sky.
He'd bring a strong man to his begging knee. He'd make the young girl's mama cry.
To his begging knee, he make the young girl's mama cry.
This guy, it seems, is no one that we'd want to mess with. John would later say that the song was about leaving home and all the crap that you encounter out in the world.
You got to jump and run.
To represent this, he chose an image of a guy with a rattlesnake hide suitcase and eyes as black as coal.
He got a suitcase covered with rattlesnake hide.
Standing right in the middle of the road that you're traveling down. Great imagery.
And it stands right in the road. You got to hide.
Many people have assumed that John Fogerty had Saul Zaentz in mind when he wrote this, but Fogerty has actually said that this wasn't the case, though he did admit that later on there were definitely times when he thought of Saul as he sang this song. However, this ominous man standing in on the road does bring to mind a darker story that has been told again and again throughout history. I mean, you guys all know it, often referred to as a Faustian bargain. The crux of the tale has someone with a desperate desire meeting the devil at the crossroads to strike a bargain. The price, however, is always one that the person regrets paying in the end. In somewhat more recent times, this story has been retold in various blues songs. Of course, the legend about blues artist Robert Johnson. In the 1930s, which claims that he went to the crossroads to make a deal with the devil in exchange for mastering the blues. All he had to do was give up his soul. I heard this as a very young man. My dad told me the story. And the story originates from an interview with the blues singer's son, House, who told how Johnson went from being a terrible guitar player to an exceptional one in just a very short period of time. This sort of exchange is exactly how John Fogerty felt about his contract with Fantasy Records. He basically had to sell his songs or part of his soul so he could make songs, so he could continue to make music. So even if Saul wasn't the direct inspiration for the song, it seems likely that on at least some subconscious level, Fogerty's experience with Fantasy had some influence on the song. The day Fogerty first heard The Old Man Down the Road playing on the radio, he was ecstatic. He was driving down the freeway in Northern California at that time. I said Fogerty in an interview, after being chained to the rack in Saul's dungeon for so many years, I was so happy, like a little kid. The song ended and I said, "Ha, take that, old man." I love that. Fogerty, what a legend. It was a breakthrough moment for the swamp rock legend and one of much needed catharsis. For Fogerty, this was more than a comeback. This was a triumph over evil. However, while Fogerty was in the midst of enjoying Centerfield's success, that euphoria disappeared. And anger started to set in again. In his words, he was just pissed off, sad, and disturbed. He became so touchy that even little things would set him off and he'd melt down. So what happened? Well, Saul's lawyer came back into his life. When Centerfield blew up, Zaentz listened to the album and didn't like what he heard. But that wasn't exactly surprising. Much of what Fogerty had written, either subtly or explicitly, it attacked Saul's character. So Saul pursued legal action against Fogerty on multiple counts. For the song Zans Can Dance, which insinuated that he was a pocket-picking pig, Zaentz slapped Fogerty and Warner Brothers with a $140 million suit for defamation of character.
Before it's over, your pocket is clean.
In response, Warner Brothers urged Fogerty to alter Zaentz to make it less obvious who the song was about. So Fogerty changed the title to Vans Cans Dance, but it wasn't enough. The record had been released, it had already sold 750,000 copies, so the suit moved ahead.
Dance, can't dance, but it's still your money.
The two parties eventually settled out of court on that. Zaentz won the case, and Fogerty, I guess, had to pay a fine.
Watching movie drive you blind.
But the legal action wouldn't end there. In regards to The Old Man Down the Road, Fantasy claimed that Fogerty had ripped off CCR's Green River.
Give it called Green River.
Later, they reversed course and stated that Fogerty had plagiarized Run Through the Jungle instead. Unbelievable.
On the loose, better run through the jungle. Road. You got to hide.
I guess they thought it was a closer match. So in essence, Fantasy, who owned the copyright for Run Through the Jungle, they were suing Fogerty for writing a song that sounded too much like himself.
Better run through the jungle. Better run through. You got the voices speaking riddle.
It didn't matter that John wrote both of those songs. If they could convince a jury that Old Man was basically the same song as Run Through the Jungle, Fantasy would reap the riches of John's new top 10 hit. And it would set a foundation across the board going forward. Now, John Fogerty described being deposed in court as one of the most stressful things he'd ever gone through. The way lawyers can attack you is unnatural, at times cruel, he said. All day long, you're terrified at what might come out of your mouth because it can and will be used against you. I was in a state of perpetual anxiety. For John, this was about more than just the fate of 2 songs. His whole life was at stake. Fantasy was trying to dissolve his authorship of The Old Man Down the Road, which again would set a devastating precedent for songwriters across the board, including himself. It meant that Old Man would no longer be considered a separate song, but a knockoff of one of his other works. If this happened, it would erase John's ability to really write any more music in his signature swamp rock style. If one guy could own another person's artistic style for the rest of his life, that would be catastrophic for every artist.
You make a river call your lover.
Later, while one of Fogerty's witnesses was on the stand, a music expert went through all of John's music, describing all their stylistic similarities between all his songs. Fantasy's lawyer asked, well, why didn't John change the parts that were similar? And the guy answered, because it wouldn't have sold a nickel's worth. Now, everyone in the courtroom laughed because it was true. When Saul took the stand, John's lawyer asked him, Mr. Zantz, isn't it true that this whole trial is just a vendetta against John Fogerty? Before he could even finish the question, Saul exploded. It's an answer to a vendetta. Vance had a complete meltdown right there on the spot. According to Fogerty, his face turned so red that he expected to see steam coming out of his ears. For John, that moment was almost worth the price of admission. When it was John's turn to testify, he got to work explaining the differences between his 2 songs and stated that there were only so many ways to play swamp rock. To illustrate this, Fogerty pulled out his Washburn guitar and plugged it into a little amp. This was a performance that would determine the future of his very career. In fact, John was playing for his life, really. Every note would be under the microscope. Any little nuance, facial expression, or wrong word said at the wrong time could spell ultimate disaster. Anything in court can be held against you. There was no room for error. But to up the ante, Fogerty had another issue to contend with. Just days before the trial, John was in his office when he let his imagination get away from him. He kept thinking about Zan sitting there in court with a smug grin on his face. I've got your money, I've got your songs, and I'm getting away with it. The anger, it just swelled up in Fogerty, and bam, he hit his office chair as hard as he could. As a result of that, he broke some bones in his hand and he had to wear a cast. So back in court, in that moment, Fogerty carefully took off his cast and he started to play his 2 songs. He went through all the particulars of what made his style his very own. He explained that there was a certain chord that he played that was really kind of swampy. As he took the jury through it step by step, just about everybody in the courtroom was enjoying the performance, I kid you not. And it became really clear that Fogerty, a true genius, had invented his own style of playing. After the demonstration on his guitar, Fogerty admitted that there were some key similarities. What he had done was invented something new that really sounds a lot like something you might expect him to play. Can you find fault with Elvis for sounding like Elvis? What about McCartney or Dylan?
You ain't nothing but
Aren't they allowed to sound like themselves? Clearly, it's pretty common for musicians to have their own signature style. Bands like Journey and Toto and Foreigner, they all have it. It's what audiences expect. Was it fair to say Fogerty couldn't have his own as well? The 6-member jury deliberated for about 3 hours, and in no small part due to his courtroom concert, Fogerty won the day. The jury was convinced that there were indeed important differences between the two songs and that any similarities could reasonably be explained as part of John Fogerty's style. However, the judge refused to hold Fantasy responsible for Fogerty's legal fees, which were about $1 million at that point. So the case was appealed all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court, mind you. There, finally, Fogerty sealed his victory, 9 votes to 0. He was subsequently awarded $1 million in attorney's fees. For once, the good guys won. And center field, it blew away the charts, thanks in no small part to The Old Man Down the Road. In March 1985, the album actually spent a week at the top of the charts, sandwiched between Wham and Phil Collins. Old Man went to number 10 on the Billboard Hot 100, and it went to number 1 on the Billboard Rock charts and was played heavily on album-oriented rock stations. Internationally, it reached number 12 in Canada and Austria, to number 11 in New Zealand, and number 10 in Australia. So it was worldwide.
When the old man comes around.
And in the end, integrity won out. But you think about it, all the great music that we lost over that 10 years that Fogerty was on the bench. Since Fogerty's comeback album, Centerfield was a reference to baseball. I'll use that to say that it would be akin to Mickey Mantle sitting on the bench for a decade after a 50-homer season in the prime of his career because of a corrupt manager. But at 40 years of age at that point, Fogerty stepped up to the plate with his team down by 3 with the bases loaded and 2 outs. Everything on the line with a bad moon rising. He drove a pitch high and deep for a grand slam to win it all. And years after, people would point to him and say, look over there, it's John Fogerty, one of the best there ever was. Leave us a comment about John Fogerty and The Old Man Down the Road. What are your memories of this song? What are your thoughts on the legal battle that he fought? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this episode, you might want to check out a couple of our shows on CCR. We have one on Fortunate Son, and then we have a top 5 on CCR as well. If you dig our content, we invite you to subscribe below. We'd love to have you as part of our community. Until next time, 3 chords and the truth, my friends.